Like with my question about the niqab and the hijab, the covering, what they wear, the Muslims wear, covering their heads. And my question with that was, why don't we? Because it said, First Corinthians 11:3-6, something.
Go ahead, girl. That's right.
Sorry, something about like the covering, like we're supposed to cover our head,
right.
And if we don't cover our head, then we should just shave off our head. But it's like pretty much a shame, abomination for a woman to shave her head, so you need to cover your head. And
right.
I was talking to somebody about that. She was reading, because I had tweeted it. I put it on Twitter. Sorry. And I was like, okay, well, why don't we do that? And she was like, she went and read some more in the chapter, and it said something about how a husband is supposed to be, head, and a woman is like right one. And honestly, I believe that. I feel like the man needs to be the man. Even if we're like, I'm not saying a man has to completely downplay me, but I mean, like, he's the head. And she was like, well, what if that? Yes, and they were like, what if that meant, a woman needs to have her man's back? And when it was like, well, if you're not willing, like, you need to cover your head of the family, your head of the family, and if you don't, then you might as well just cut it all off. Right. You don't have a family if you're not willing to cover your family. Right. And I was like, well, that's a nice way, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Maybe it's not necessarily saying we need to cover our heads, but I've always felt reverent with something. I don't know, like Jews do it. They have their I cannot remember the name of it. The little hat.
Yes.
And it's just slipping my mind. Muslims wear, a lot of other religions. Monks will sit there and bow their head and have something like over at least the building where they're praying. I just noticed that there's something always covering their head, and I just feel like, even I see Baptists wear the really, really, really big hats.
Yeah.
Like, Baptists are really known for
the holiness. Holiness denomination, they still wear little
nuns cover their head.
Nuns, oh my goodness.
No, like, I'm just saying, like, there's somebody they're always covering their head, and not like within the last 2 years, I've noticed that I've like bought more like hats, knit caps, something, and I was like, I feel wrong just walking with my head out all the time.
Now, in that scripture, you go back and read it. It puts it in the context of praying and prophesying. So, I don't have a good answer for you, except I've looked at that text too. And when you are reading passages of scripture and trying to understand them, number one, you know about the cultural background. So, so they have a cultural background. Women were wearing veils. Okay, they've been wearing veils. You know that. Okay, so we don't wear veils now. So, what's the difference? With the scriptures, there's always a universal truth. There's always a universal principle that God is trying to relate. So the Bible transcends the culture of the time it was written to all times. Otherwise, it would be kind of useless to us. So it's the principles that are there. So I guess my question would be, what would be the underlying principle of why the women are wearing the veils? Why the women are wearing the head coverings and the kabbalah and all that stuff? And the that passage, you got to read that whole passage all the way through chapter 2 through verse 11. It refers to it being done for the angels. Okay, so I ain't gonna answer it, but
didn't angels
cover over the Shekinah glory, over God's glory? Yes, they cover all that, but it's for the angels, and it refers back to creation as well. So the reason why the head cover should be worn is not because of tradition or culture, but because of the angels, because of creation. And I think, this is my personal feeling on that, is that, I think it's okay for women to wear hats, especially praying and prophesying in a religious context. Makes sense. So going around wearing a hat, big old hat, and going out to the baseball field, maybe not. But from the context of scriptures there, wearing a hat would be appropriate for church. But then, I was saying, okay, are we just wrong? Because God should be striking us down for not doing it. And I was looking at it, and I think that when you look at that passage, and you look at other passages in the scriptures where it talks about there should be a difference between men and women, and, what they wear, and then other passages about what Peter said, about how women should be dressed, how adorned, and all this stuff. But that passage in 1 Corinthians is dealing with a principle, especially the principle about the distinction between men and women, praying and prophesying. So it's in that context. So I'll leave it like that, because we'll talk about that later.